All right. Well, I know most of you, but I'm Helen Alexander, and I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker, Chris Helzer. Chris is an expert on prairie ecology, a topic that is really critical to those of us who live in Northeast Kansas. As I think most of you know, most of the landscape, 90% or so, was tallgrass prairie in the mid-1800s, and now it's less than 1%. Chris will speak today on the topic here about restoration management with resilience and diversity. Tomorrow at 1:30, he will be talking at the auditorium of the Lawrence Public Library. His talk tomorrow has a wonderful title, The Incredible Beauty, Diversity, and Complexity of Prairies and Why You Should Love Them. Sarah reminded me that at 5 o'clock today, we're going to have an informal reception at the Sunflower downtown. So Chris is the Director of Science and Stewardship for the Nature Conservancy in Nebraska. He conducts research, supervises the Conservancy's Preserve Stewardship program, and helps develop and test prairie management and restoration strategies. Chris is also really dedicated to raising awareness about the value of prairies through his presentations, like today, his amazing photographs and his writing. I expect as I look out at this audience, most of you are well aware of this, but everybody should Google Prairie Ecologist to see his excellent blog. It has really great essays, superb photos, and it covers a huge number of topics from prairie ecology, nuts and bolts of management, to just kind of the secret lives of plants and animals. He has written 2 books, The Ecology and Management of Prairies in the Central United States, and Hidden Prairie, Photographing Life in 1 Square Meter. And the latter is exactly that. He's staked out a 1 by 1 meter area and has tracked what he sees in it. And in 2024, if I read his website correctly, he's seen 300 species of plants, animals, and fungi in that tiny little area. The Raven Bookstore will have both books tomorrow after the library presentation to purchase, and Chris is willing to sign them. So this visit is sponsored by the Kansas Biological Survey and Center for Ecological Research, as many of you are affiliated with, the Grassland Heritage Foundation, and the Lawrence Public Library. I want to take the time as a board member for Grassland Heritage to just briefly mention who we are. We're a nonprofit that manages prairies and provides scholarships for students who are doing prairie research. So those of you out there should be aware of that. About monthly, we do management work on local prairies, and we greatly encourage anybody to join us. We also recently began a Sustaining Prairies Fund to help out schools and other community groups who have begun prairie restorations or prairie gardens, but need some money to help support them and keep them going. To support all these activities, please join us in the spring and fall at our native plant sale fundraiser. And if anybody's interested in details about some of the things I mentioned, I have some flyers with me. But Chris, take it away.
Thanks, Helen. Yeah, it's really nice to be here. I appreciate being invited. Hopefully we'll have time to have some really good discussion afterwards. Now, there we go. I'm going to talk very briefly about the Nature Conservancy. This is not a sales pitch. It's context. This is where I'm coming from, right? So hopefully you're all familiar with the Nature Conservancy. If you're not, we're an organization that thinks about biodiversity and humans sort of working together. So we're conserving biodiversity for its own sake, but also for people, and vice versa. We're a big organization. We work around the world, lots of scientists. In Nebraska, I don't know, I'm not going to talk about the Kansas chapter because that's not where I'm from, but Kansas does a lot of great work too. But just so you know kind of what we're doing in Nebraska, we have a program that focuses on renewable energy and climate change work. A lot of that is working with policymakers, state senators, national senators, congresspeople. And we've had some pretty remarkable success actually getting senators that you wouldn't expect to, co-sponsor climate change bills and things. So it's a really important part of our work. I'm glad it's not me doing it, but I'm glad that we're doing it. Similarly, our row crop program, we do a lot of work with row crop farming in Nebraska, especially around nutrient management, water use efficiency, things like that, helping to connect farmers with technology and equipment that they need and the know-how to use things that are good for them and good for the objectives of the Conservancy and us as a people. And then we do a lot of work in the Nebraska Sandhills, which if you're not familiar with the Nebraska Sandhills, you should be. And hopefully everybody here knows about them. But it's, 12 million acres, a contiguous prairie in the middle of Nebraska. It's the largest contiguous prairie landscape in the US and the North America, second largest in the world. Anyway, it's a cool place. And we have a lot of eastern red cedars coming in on the eastern edge. And so trying to help Sandhills ranchers and change the culture there in the Sandhills community of, fire is a scary thing because you're in 12 million acres of contiguous dry grassland. That's a scary part of fire. And so ranchers are really good at being set up to put out fires, but they're interested in using fire in different ways. And so we have a program that works with that. We train them, we go out and help them lead the fire the first couple of times, connect them with equipment, connect them with each other, do a lot of that kind of work. And then the last piece, besides my stuff, is we're starting to work on the eastern edge of the Sandhills on lands where, the Sandhills sort of breaks up into cropland landscape. And on that edge, there's a lot of land that sort of flickers in and out of grassland and cropland. And so I'm trying to solidify that on the grassland side, hopefully, by working with landowners and trying to figure out how to make the grassland component more valuable to them and to help them smooth through the process of finding the funding that they need and the logistics they need to use that grassland as part of their farming or ranching operations. Anyway, we're just getting started on that. I'm optimistic. I think it'll be a fun program. But this is where I live. I supervise our preserve stewardship team, where a lot of our two primary goals really are to manage the sites that we own for biodiversity, and then to learn as much as we can while we do that so that we can share that learning with other people. So we're thinking a lot about trying out new ideas, setting up our stewardship as demonstration sites. A lot of times we'll do things side by side in 2 different ways or 3 different ways. Even if we think we know what's going to happen, we'll set it up that way. So when we bring people there, we can talk about the differences. And then I do a lot of work like this, and I'll talk about this more later, but I spend a ton of time leading field days on our sites or coming out to places like this and talking to landowners and college students and academics and land managers of all kinds. So the 2 primary properties that we've got that we manage with our staff are the Niobrara Valley Preserve and the Platte River Prairies. The Niobrara Valley Preserve is the big one. It's 56,000 acres, 25 miles of riverfront along the Niobrara River. Anybody here ever float down the Niobrara River? Yeah, so you floated right past us. Everything on the south side, basically, that you floated by is us. We've got a couple herds of bison on large prairie landscapes. There's, 30 some sharp-tailed grouse leks. It's a cool large landscape with a lot of good grassland stuff happening. So here's what it looks like from the air. You can see on the right-hand side is where the Sandhills, kind of the north edge of the Sandhills. So that goes, for hundreds of miles south of there. It's a really cool prairie landscape. If you've spent any time there, like any prairie, it's mostly subtle, but beautiful anyway. This is what the land looks like. You can see how it's kind of arrayed along the Niobrara River, and about half of it is grazed with bison and half with cattle. So we own the bison, and the 2 bison herds run on pasture sizes of 10,000 or 12,000 acres apiece. So they've got a lot of space to move around. They can kind of act like bison. But the cattle work is just as important, maybe more important especially in terms of influencing the landscape. All of our neighbors have cattle. And so we bring their cattle into our property and manage the herds in the way that we want to and learn what we can, and then hopefully try to transfer knowledge out, both through our lessees and through other people that work with them. And it's just a cool spot. It's got a lot of waterfalls coming down through the, Sandhills water filters through the Sandhills and then laterally out into the river. We use a lot of fire and grazing, both with cattle and bison, and then a lot of time bringing people out to the site to show them the site and what we're doing. Similarly, the Platte River Prairies, much smaller landscape and more fragmented. This is where the sandhill cranes come every spring. So again, if you've never been, it's something you should see. You've got about 1 million of them now that come through every March and spend, each bird spends about 3 weeks there. But one of my jobs is to remind people that there's a lot more than just cranes on the Central Platte River. So we've done a lot of restoration work. We work closely with Prairie Plains Resource Institute, which is in Aurora, where I live. trying to sort of defragment the landscape and do that, but also show that it can be done so that we can inspire others to do it. So we have a lot of sub-irrigated grasslands, and we do a lot of fire grazing and outreach work. Okay, so I say all that as context. This is a little bit more context. I think probably everybody in the room knows what ecological resilience is, but I want to explain it from my perspective so you know where I'm coming from. So I think about prairies as a ball rolling around in a bowl, right? So the ball is the prairie, the bowl is the regime or the range of stability that ball can stay in and still be itself, right? So you can push that ball around the bowl. And in fact, I think it's important to push the ball around the bowl. And as long as it stays within the bowl, it's still the same prairie, has the same functions, supports the same sort of essential processes. But we can push it too hard, and we can push it out of that bowl into a different one and becomes something different. And you really can't go backwards as far as we can tell. So examples, obvious examples, right? If you turn it into a soybean field, that's a different bowl. It can still be resilient in its new bowl, but it's different. But also something like woody encroachment. You can take a prairie with trees and become a woodland with openings. And when you cross that boundary, there's so many fundamental things that change, including things like soil chemistry, that just cutting the trees doesn't take you back to where you were before, right? And then the one that I think about the most, and it's the most subtle, but maybe the most important, is that you can degrade a prairie in terms of losing diversity, losing plant diversity, invertebrate diversity, all these other things. And you can get to the point where I think we're in a different bowl. And the reason I think that is that I've managed prairies like that for close to 30 years now, and they don't go back in the other direction. We have to do things like go and throw seeds on the ground of some of the species that are missing. We can get some of those back, but it's just not the same prairie that it was. So I think there's a threshold there as well that's harder to identify. That comes about through things like chronic overgrazing or broadcast herbicide use, that we can really cross that threshold and in a way that we can't come back from. So as prairie managers, our job really is to keep the ball in the bowl. I also think that our job is to stretch the bowl. So I think moving that ball around keeps that bowl nice and big, and it makes it harder for the ball to come out. And so I think, using different fire and grazing strategies to push the boundaries a little bit and make it go through its paces. It's like physical exercise, right? If you exercise your muscles, they'll be there when you need them. I think that's important with prairies as well. So that's how I think about it. I think there's two main pillars that maintain resilience. One is species diversity, because you have redundancy of function and there's a diversity of roles, all those sort of things that you all know about. And then obviously things like habitat size and connectivity, right? So a larger, more connected landscape is going to be more resilient because you have larger, more connected populations, for example. So for the second one, I want to talk about the prairie restoration work that we do. The basics of it, I'm not going to spend a lot of time. We harvest seed mostly by hand, some by machine, and we try to get the most diverse seed mixes we can. We literally throw it on the ground. This is a broadcast seeder that just drops the seeds out the bottom of it. It's got a little agitator inside that's about as technologically advanced as it is. But we also do a lot of prairie planting by hand, which works fine too. We just throw it on the ground. And I'm part of a grassland restoration network that is a kind of an informal network that we built 21 years ago now. And we get together at a different site every year. And one of the really neat common threads that come out of that is that everybody in the network has found that broadcasting seed works just fine. You can drill seed also, and that's also good. But broadcasting in a dormant season on a soybean field that's been harvested is a consistently successful method across all the Great Plains and all the Midwest. So there's lots of other ways to do it, but that way seems to always work too. That's been a kind of a cool lesson to learn. So when we do it, first year, just like everywhere else, it looks like you just stop farming and let all the weeds come in, which is basically what we did. But underneath the weeds is the good stuff. And we're lucky we don't have a lot of perennial invasives that we really worry about those early years. We might have a few musk thistles or something like that. But for the most part, we just have to wait and hope that it works. And then you end up with your prairie vegetation. But we have a lot of opportunities to do wetland work too, because we have we're on a floodplain. We've got a lot of sub-irrigated sites, and a remnant prairie has the old river channel scars coming through it. And those river channel scars are closer to groundwater, so they have more of a sedge meadow or a wetland community. And when you have an agricultural field, they normally try to get rid of those features to make it easier to farm, especially if you're irrigating with gravity. So when we do restoration, if we have the opportunity, we'll try to put some of those features back in. And then the process is the same. We harvest seed, throw it on the ground, let it establish. So what we hope is that we can take a landscape that has remnant unplowed prairies like this, and this is one of our sites. We can fill in some of those gaps with replanted vegetation and ideally reestablish connections, right? And make it act like a larger, more connected landscape. In addition, we can take some of those prairies that are in a different bowl now that have lost a lot of its diversity, and we can try to take them from like a C- to a B, maybe would be one way to think about it. And what we do is we incorporate it generally, most of the time we incorporate it into our patch burn grazing, which I'll talk about here in a little bit. But we burn, throw the seeds on the ground, put cattle on top of that. The cattle probably help get the seeds into the soil a little bit, but their primary role, from my perspective, is to control the competition from the existing plants. And it takes a lot more seed to do this than it does in a cropland restoration. Cropland restoration, any seed you throw out is going to land in a spot where it's got a pretty good chance of success. In a prairie like this, even if we're managing the competition, there are a lot of places a seed's going to land where it lands on top of an existing plant. It's not going to do anything there. So if we were really smart and had the time and we knew exactly where to put each seed where it might have a success, we could use a lot fewer seeds. That's not us. So we harvest a lot of seeds. It's cheap for us to harvest it because we're harvesting ourselves. We just dump loads of it out there, and we use 4 to 8 times the seed amounts in an overseeding situation than we would use in a crop field situation. And it works pretty nice. It's not always dramatic, but it's often dramatic in terms of what the response looks like. And it makes me feel good, even knowing that there's still a lot of stuff missing out there. At least there's something for bees to do something with in the summer. The habitat structure, architecture of the prairie is very different after we do that kind of work. So ecological restoration, I think the general public tends to think of ecological restoration just like they would think of restoring an old building or a car, right? We're trying to get it back to what it used to be, which I think is the wrong way to think about it. But I understand why people think about it that way. So with historic buildings, we're trying to get them back to, it's more of an educational outreach exercise, right? So we're trying to show what it used to be. We use the original materials or the best replicas we can. We know exactly what it's supposed to look like when we're done. Wouldn't that be nice if we could do that ecologically? No, it wouldn't be fun. But I think it's better to think about ecological restoration like we're restoring a city after a disaster. So if you think about a city that's been hit by a hurricane, for example, it doesn't matter what it looks like exactly. It doesn't have to look exactly like it did before. It has to work. It just has to function, right? So when you're restoring a city, you're trying to make sure that people can survive. They can get to where they need to be. They have a place to live. They have food. There's communication systems. All those sorts of things are reestablished. And it's a lot more flexible, and because you're focusing on the function, not on sort of the structure or the appearance, right? So there's a lot of ways to do it well. But going back to exactly what it was is not necessarily the goal. In fact, a lot of times we end up better than we were before, because you're taking advantage of the situation, I guess. So anyway, when I talk to people in the public about this is the analogy I use, which I think works, or at least works well enough. So does it work? We know we can make pretty fields full of flowers, and that's nice, but that's not really the objective. So if we're trying to reconnect the prairie and make a more viable, more resilient landscape, the first thing that has to happen is we have to make sure that we can maintain the diversity of plants that we harvest. We spent a lot of time harvesting those species from, say, 200 different plant species on a planting. Do they stick around? So here's a quick example. There's a site that I planted in 2000. It looks nice. We used 202 plant species in the original seed mix. I've documented 192 plant species. Some of those are plants we didn't plant ourselves, they came in on their own. But for the most part, what we planted has shown up. And the things that haven't shown up, there's probably a few of them I just haven't seen yet. And I'll show you later how I get to this data, but I just briefly, just to point out that we are tracking this with data, right? I go out and count plants. Our species richness at the square meter scale has been really stable. over the last several years. I can look at individual plant species and look at how their patterns look. Some of them are increasing, some of them are stable, some of them bounce all over the place, just like a prairie should be. But the more important measure really is on the animal side, in terms of, are we connecting this landscape back together for those other species, not just animals, but things that move around. So I'm going to give you a few examples of things we've done. None of this has been sort of rigorous publishable research, but it's been enough that it helps us sort of evaluate how we're doing. So we've done some inventories of ants. We've looked at sort of our unplowed remnant prairies, and we've looked at our restored prairies to see what ant species are in different places. The only ant species we found that was in remnant prairies only and not in restored prairies is an arboreal ant that lives in trees. So I don't really care. That's fine. They can have the trees. But overall, we haven't found any ant species that look like they're tied to remnants that aren't using the restored habitat. That's good news, right? There's a lot of other questions we could ask there, but at least we're finding them in our restored habitat. Similar with bees. Bees are hard because our sample size has not been enough to be fully confident about this, but we've found the majority of bees are in both remnant and restored habitats. And the ones that are in one or the other, we actually have more in the restored habitat than the remnant habitat, which again, this is a sample size issue, but we're not seeing any downsides. We're not seeing any risk factors that make us think there's something fundamentally wrong with our restorations from the perspective of bees. We've gone a little bit past that. One of our Hubbard fellows, Emma Greenlee, did a cool project a couple of years ago where she picked out 5 pairs of sites where we had restored and remnant habitat next to each other. And she compared flower resources through the season by going out every 2 weeks and walking transects and just counting flowers of different species. And one of the things she found was that they were fairly similar in the richness abundance. There were some differences in the composition, which is fine. It's again, city restoration, not building restoration. But one of the great things was there were a lot of times where the 2 sites complemented each other in terms of the resources provided. So if there was a downed, kind of a low time in the remnant prairie, for example, where there just wasn't a lot blooming, often the restored prairie right next to it had a whole bunch of stuff blooming. So the bees and other pollinators that were close to those boundaries had a lot of choices about where to go within that landscape. So that makes me feel pretty good. And I think it backs up some of the value of not trying to do the building restoration model, right? There's a lot of value in them not being identical to each other, but being complementary and supportive. We've looked at grasshoppers and katydids and tree crickets. Another one of our Hubbard fellows did this project, and he looked at 16 species, found one that was only in remnants, but the one that was only in remnants, he only found 2 of them. And so again, probably a sample size issue. And there were 2 that he only found in restorations, which I think is the same thing. But by and large, grasshoppers, katydids, crickets are doing well in both sites. And then the last one I'll talk about is small mammals, where Jasmine looked at the species composition. We had the same species, but in different numbers, different relative abundance between the 2 types. So for example, deer mice, harvest mice, and voles were more common in the restored prairie. The grasshopper mice was about the same in both. And then the remnant prairie had higher numbers of plains pocket mouse and least shrew, but they were all using all the habitats. They just had favorites between those 2 types. So I feel good about that. But again, we're just sort of scraping the surface, right? We have enough information that I feel like we're on the right path, and I would recommend it to others. But there's a ton of questions that I'd like to ask, especially around genetics. There's a lot of work I'd love to see done, where we track animals and see how they're actually using those habitats. Are they living in both? Are they just living in one and using the other for resources? Can we show that we're improving metapopulation dynamics, those sorts of things? Tons of work left to do, okay? I want to switch now and talk about land stewardship. And some of this will relate back to the restorations because a lot of the land that we're managing is restored. But I want to start making sure we're all on the same page in terms of humans and stewardship of land, right? So there's a really cool, there's many great projects that show this relationship. The one I'll mention here is the one that's cited, which is about 3/4 of the Earth's nature has had, human influence, human stewardship for 20 to 30,000 years, depending on where you're at. So there's very little nature on Earth that isn't strongly tied to humans and that intentional management that's been going on for a very, very, very long time. And I think most people in North America don't see that connection, right? We're still in that mode of the best nature is the nature that doesn't need us anymore. Our best thing we could do is stay out of nature. And that just doesn't fit reality. And there's multiple problems with that. And in the prairies, I think it's especially important. You know, since the last glaciers receded from the prairies, depending on where you're at, 8 to 10 to 12,000 years ago, prairies developed in large part because of people, right? And definitely developed hand in hand with people. And the use of fire was a big piece of that. But, you know, indigenous people were moving plants around the landscape. They were managing populations of animals through hunting and influencing in very strong ways the way all of those things work together. So, and they were doing it intentionally. It wasn't an accidental thing, right? They didn't just go out and haphazardly do things. So I think there's two reasons that that's really important for all of us to stress as we work with people and talk about management. The first is it's the right thing to do to pay tribute to all the work that's been happening long before many of us showed up here, right? And continues to happen. And then the second one is that we have a responsibility now to continue that. And so if we don't recognize that there's this chain of stewardship that's been going on for a long time, we sort of absolve ourselves of the responsibility to continue that going forward. And I just think that's really important. So along those lines, when we manage for ecological resilience on our sites in Nebraska, this is sort of the thought process that we have, right? We want resilience. To get resilience, we need species diversity, assuming we have the landscape connectivity and size, which that's the restoration piece. And then when we're thinking about species diversity, we focus on habitat heterogeneity. So that's what we aim for, and that's what we measure most of the time. And I'll explain that here in just a second. So in prairies, habitat heterogeneity can be a little bit harder for some people to visualize because you think about forests and you can imagine the different kinds of structure, right? You got the canopy and the understory and the shrub layer and the herbaceous layer and the leaf layer and all those sorts of things. But there's a lot of architecture in prairies as well. You can have tall and dense habitat. You can have patchy habitat where every step you're stepping on a different height or density of vegetation. You can have uniformly short areas. And then you can have some really interesting, really fun structure where some of the plants are short and some of them are tall and they're really intermixed. And the only way to create this is with grazing because you can have a selective animal that goes out there and chooses what to eat and what not to. I shouldn't say it. You could also do it with a weed whacker, I suppose, if you had a lot of time and you were really creative and involved in the project. So why does that matter? Why do we need all those different types? And the simple answer is that there are different species that require each of those different types of structure, right? So there are things like upland sandpipers that want large areas of short habitat. You've got Henslow sparrows that like a lot more dense vegetation with some old dead stuff mixed in. But the same is true with insects. There are different insects. Insects have different sort of habitat requirements, and so do plants, right? Plants have definite preferences or definite habitat niches that have to do with competition, shade, all those sorts of things. So having a variety of habitat structures can be good for all of those different types of taxa. And what we really want is not just to have them, but to move them around the landscape. So you have sort of a shifting mosaic of all those different habitat types. And this is my fancy animation of that. So you put your habitat types out and you move them around the landscape, right? Spent a lot of time on that. Okay, so here's what it looks like from the air. This is an example of one of our sites on the Platte River where you see 4 different types of habitat in the same 200-acre prairie management unit. And if I take this picture a year later, they'd all be in a slightly different place. There's a lot of ways to create this shifting mosaic. And I'm not going to advocate for one over the other, but I want to give you a few examples. Probably how many people have heard of patch burn grazing? Yeah, that's what I thought. Good for you. So patch burn grazing is great for habitat heterogeneity. It sort of creates it by default. It's what it's designed for. And it also has enough fire that depending on where you're at, it can help with your woody encroachment issues too. Maybe more importantly, it really helps promote high quality forage for the livestock. So it makes sense from a production standpoint, given other logistical issues. And so basically the idea, right, you burn it, creates this nice green forage that's attractive to grazing animals of bison, cattle, other large animals. So because that works, you can burn one site or one part of your prairie one year. That's where your grazing is concentrated. You burn a different piece. The next year, grazers concentrate over there. Excellent. Here's what it looks like on the plat with a summer fire and cattle. Really focuses cattle grazing because of that summer fire. Okay, from a plant community, I want to show you an example of what it looks like in a restored prairie. So this is a prairie that was planted in 2000. It's actually the same one I talked about earlier. And this is the site that was burned and grazed in the spring. It was burned in the spring of 2016. This is a late July photo. And what you see here is that there's been a lot of grazing that's happened. Most of the grasses here are big bluestem Indian grass, switchgrass, tall grass prairie species. But they don't look very tall in this picture because they've been grazed repeatedly and it's been a hot, dry summer. And a lot of them have just said, I'm done with this, and they've given up and they went dormant in July. This looks like a stressed ecosystem. And it is, in a way. But you can also see that selective grazing means that there's some things out there that weren't grazed. There's still some pollinator resources, for example. There's some habitat structure besides just uniformly short. But there's a lot of habitat that an upland sandpiper would find really nice to nest in, for example. This is a year later on the same site. So what's happening here is those tall grass prairie grasses, the big bluestem Indian grass, switchgrass, and others. By July here, where it's normally about time for them to bloom, you would expect them to be 5 feet or taller. They're about 10 inches tall because that's about all the energy they have left to grow. So the previous year stressed them enough, mostly by repeated grazing. The drought didn't really have as much to do it, but the repeated grazing, every time they put up a new tiller, it got grazed off again, depleted carbohydrate reserves, all those sorts of things. So that makes them less competitive. Because they're less competitive, they're not the big gorilla in the room anymore. And there's all these other plants that have a chance to sort of come up and compete in a way that they weren't able to compete before. And so you have this sort of wildflower party going on, which is fantastic for a lot of insects, including pollinators. And it lasts about a year or so, depending on the weather and other factors. And then those grasses sort of come back and reassert their dominance in that ecosystem. As an example, this is the unburned site from that year. So this is 2017, so it was a year after the fire and grazing, but this is the site that didn't get burned, which means it didn't get grazed very much the previous year. So the big grasses are still there. They're still pretty dominant. You have wildflowers, but they're a different set of wildflowers. It's good habitat, but it's different than the other examples. So all of these are available at the same time in one of our prairies, which is what we're aiming for. So patch burn grazing is great for habitat heterogeneity. The problem with patch burn grazing, especially in Nebraska, is we don't have a great fire culture in Nebraska. You know, there are parts of Kansas that have a really strong private landowner fire culture, which is amazing. We're moving in that direction, but it's going to be a while. And even if we get to that, I just don't think in places like the Nebraska Sandhills, for example, that patch burn grazing makes a whole lot of sense. And I say that as somebody who's like, I helped start patch burn grazing. I'm a big fan. I really like it. We use it. I love it. But it just doesn't work. And one of the reasons is that if you're a Sandhills rancher, for example, you might have 6 or 7 different management units that you manage, you know, pasture areas that are separated by things that you can't just graze them all at the same time, which means if you want to patch burn all those sites, that's 6 or 7 fires a year that you have to do. We can't get most Sandhills ranchers to do 1 fire a year. And if we did have all that much fire, and let's say they were burning on a 4-year frequency, that's 12 million acres divided by 4, which is a lot of acres. That's, I think, 3 million acres or something. That much smoke alone is going to be problematic, right? Let alone all the logistics and everything else. I just don't think we're going to have that much fire. And the ranchers don't want it. So patch burn grazing is also weird. Like, I love it, but it's weird. Maybe that's why I love it. But ranchers are used to, most ranchers, at least in Nebraska, are used to having some way of fencing out cattle and fencing them in and moving them and controlling that. They like to be in control of where their cows are. And if we're not using that infrastructure or building off of where they're at, we have a lot less likelihood of getting them to do what we want. And even that sounds wrong. That's not what I mean to say. We're not going to be able to encourage them to use heterogeneity focused management if we're not using something that's familiar to them, right? That's a better way to say that. So we're playing with an idea now on the plat. We've been doing this since, well, I've been doing it on my own prairie for 12 years now. I think we've been doing it on the Platte River Prairie since 2018. And basically the idea is to use a 4 pasture rotation setup in this example. by using the cross fences and the water's in the middle, and we can put cows in all 4 pastures. But instead of moving cattle from A to B to C to D and closing the gate behind them each time, what we do is we start them in pasture A at the beginning of the year, and we open the gate to pasture B and we leave the gate open. So what happens is they can move into the new area and have a wider selection of diet, but they have the ability to continue to go back to where they started, which is where the higher quality forage is, because they've created regrowth by grazing plants down. Those plants are putting out new tillers, which are the most nutritious, high quality forage available. So the cows want to keep grazing that. In a typical rotational system, you move them out of there, you close the gate, and all that high quality forage just doesn't get used by the cattle from a livestock standpoint. So here, they've got the ability to go back and use what they had, but they also can expand and pick out new things if they want. So they have a lot of control over their diet, which means they're doing well performance-wise. And then later in the season, if we want to, we can open up a third pasture and allow them access to more. We could also, by the way, go back and close the gate to pasture A if we feel like we need to at some part of the season. This is not a recipe, it's a concept, right? And then in our case, we almost never use the third pasture in a season, and pasture D here always gets rested. And so it usually gets about 2 years of full rest after being grazed. So the way we actually run it most of the time is that pasture A gets an entire season of grazing. Pasture B gets grazed for usually the second half of the season at the same time as A. And then C and D pretty much get a full rest for 2 seasons. So they get a great year and a half of pretty intensive grazing, and then 2 full years to recover from that. The stocking rate we use here would be the same as we use in patch burn grazing. It'd be the same that our neighbors would use if they were doing a standard 4 pasture rotation. So there's no downside on that. But we're letting livestock have more control over their diet, and we're creating a whole lot more heterogeneity out of this system. And so we've done a lot of, I'm not going to talk about, we've done a lot of data collection showing that the habitat structure heterogeneity is just as good here as it is with our patch burn, which is nice. But this doesn't rely on fire. You can still burn, right? I mean, at least half of this would burn every year if you wanted to. So if you had a cedar tree issue, or if you had objectives you wanted to meet with fire, you can still do that. But if you don't want to burn, the system keeps moving, which is a huge advantage, I think, at least in some cases. So, and then just to lay it out, in one individual pasture, this is the progression they would go through, right? So there'd be, it gets grazed for the second half of the season first. The next year it gets grazed for an entire season, and then it comes out of that year and a half of pretty tough life and goes into 2 seasons of rest. So here's what it looks like on our family prairie south of Aurora, where I live. And this is my fancy high-tech measuring tool for habitat. But you can see that there's a lot different amounts of the spade that you can see from place to place. So pasture D here, by the way, is the most interesting one. That's that weedy recovery, first year out of grazing, where all the fun stuff happens. In my case, on our prairie, there's a lot of western ragweed, which isn't everybody's favorite plant, but it's a pretty great plant. And go out in the winter, by the way, in the snow, and see where the birds are feeding. That tells you how great that plant is, because it's all western ragweed. Anyway, there's a lot of heterogeneity there. So I'll show a little bit of data. And this first data is a little sketchy for me because I'm not a soils person. I know Sarah Bear's in the room and other people. But Greg Peck at the University of Nebraska Kearney and I have been trying to track what's happening underneath the ground in an open gate rotational system. Because as we tried to talk about this to private landowners, in a very good way, this is one of the first questions they have, is that it sounds fun, but what's going on with the soil, right? And so we're 3 years in. I'm sure this is based on 2 years of data. It's not a data graph, it's a concept graph, but it's based on 2 years of data so far. The third year looks the same as this. And what we're seeing basically is our soil organic matter is increasing in all 4 pastures, which is good news. It increased at different rates between those 4, and I'll talk about that in a second. Root production underneath the ground goes way up in the year that it's being grazed the hardest, when those plants are investing in below ground rather than above ground resources. Microbial activity sort of changes through time, but it's all positive. It's good. The control plots on the right, by the way, we've got a set of plots that we clip every month, and we've been doing that for the 3 years of this project so far. And we have another set that we don't do anything with, that they just sit there. So we're using those sort of as a comparison, right? So another way to look at this would be the rate of accumulation of soil organic matter is positive on all 4 pastures, but it's the highest in the area that's been rested the most. What I really want to do long-term is I'd like to set up a comparison where we do a standard 4 pasture rotation and we do the open gate rotation next to each other on similar sites, and we see what that looks like, because I'm guessing in the 4 pasture rotation, you're going to have positive results too, but it'll be fairly steady, as opposed to ours where it's sort of more up and down. But I'd love to know what the average amount of soil organic matter accumulation is between those two. Also, I want to point out that the reason I think we're getting soil accumulation is that this is a degraded remnant, so it has room to go, right? It's not at capacity as a full high quality remnant prairie would be. So you can ask me questions about this later. Don't expect me to have great answers. Talk to Greg. What I can talk about is the plant community monitoring. So I talked a little bit about this earlier. Basically, what I'm doing when I'm collecting this data is I go out with a bunch of 1 by 1, I take one by 1 meter plot frame, plop it down on the ground 70 times, stratified across the site. I list the plant species that are in each of those quadrats, and then I can calculate frequency of occurrence. I can even look at mean species richness, and I can do mean floristic quality if you like that. So if you're not familiar with floristic quality, I'm not going to go into all of it, but basically it's a way to take species diversity and add some qualitative measures to it. You can assign a value of conservatism to plant species from 0 to 10 based on whether it's something that, you know, shows up in a crack in the sidewalk or shows up in only a site that is really well managed or that we think is in good shape. White fringed orchid would be a 10 or a 9 or something close to that. And Western ragweed, my friend, would be a 1 probably, or maybe even a 0. Okay, anyway, so from those plots, I can look at things like this 1995 planting planted by Prairie Plains Resource Institute, actually, a bunch of people walking around in May throwing seed on the ground. And you can see that the species richness over time has been really stable. That's great news, right? That's exactly what we want from our restoration goals, but it also shows that our management's not hurting species richness. Mean floristic quality has the same pattern, so that's great too. We can look at individual species. So things like big blue stem, switchgrass, and Indian grass in the top graph have been pretty stable. Maybe slight increases there in the Indian grass and switchgrass over time, where little blue stem and Canada wild rye in the bottom graph sort of decreased for a while, and it looks like maybe they've stabilized at a lower point. They've sort of adapted to the actual site conditions rather than starting out based on the number of seeds that we planted. Now it's sort of settled into a pattern that fits the prairie itself. We can do the same thing with sunflowers. This is Maximilian and stiff sunflower. Look at prairie clovers. A lot of this, I'm just showing you that I have the data. Goldenrods. So the news has been good. This is the graph I really wanted to get to. And I'm going to do this with a couple other sites in a minute. So Kentucky bluegrass, which is an invasive, has really increased over time to the point where it's basically in 100% of those 70 plots that I put out there, right? So this seems like maybe a bad thing. Let me show you another site. This is the 2000 restoration I've talked about twice already. Species richness looks great. Mean floristic quality looks great. Individual species are doing fine, different patterns in different places, but no warning signs. Everybody's happy. Even the black-eyed Susan, which looks like it's disappeared, it's still there. It's just not abundant enough to show up in the 70 plots. It might be next year. And then this is the graph I wanted to show you. So again, Kentucky bluegrass in blue is up to 90% frequency of occurrence. Smooth brome is also increasing. That seems problematic. Last one. This is a 2002 restoration, so it's a couple years younger. And in this site, we have a 9-acre exclosure up in one corner that we use as not a control, but a comparison. And so what you're seeing here is the blue would be the pattern in that exclosure, and the orange is the pattern out in the grazed area, right? And what's important really is to look at where they started and then where they ended. And what you can see is we've increased our species richness relative to, between treatments. The grazed area has higher species richness at that square meter scale than the ungrazed. They're both doing great. There's no problem with either of them. And again, this is not a replicated study. Don't read too much into it. It's a way for us to help see whether we feel like we're going in the right direction, okay? Mean floristic quality is pretty much identical. It started and stopped in the same place. So again, there's no problem from a plant community standpoint with either of these examples. And it's kind of fun to look at individual species. So big bluestem doesn't seem to care. It's doing fine in both. But Indian grass, really interestingly to me, is occurs much more frequently in the grazed area than the ungrazed. I was surprised by that because it's one of their favorite plants for cows to eat. I assumed it would, be impacted that by grazing, maybe even be less abundant in the grazed area, but it's the opposite. Stiff sunflower and Maximilian sunflower. Stiff sunflower does great in both. Maximilian likes the ungrazed a little bit better, but cows like to eat both of them. Anyway, we have the same data for all these other species. Okay, just showing you that I have it. Again, it's not replicated. Don't read too much into it. It's just interesting. But get back to this again. And now we have some more data to go off of to help us interpret the story. What we're really seeing here, I think, is that the Kentucky bluegrass and smooth brome increases we're seeing are really tied to grazing. So you could reasonably ask the question, well, Helzer, why are you grazing these sites then? Because it's bad for your prairie plants. You're getting more brome and bluegrass. Okay, and I have two answers for that. The first is habitat heterogeneity is really important for things other than plants. And we know we're getting much better heterogeneity in the sites that we're grazing than the sites that we just burn and let be the same habitat structure across the site. And the second piece is, let me refer you back to these graphs, right? So we are seeing an increase in brome and bluegrass for sure. And you can see it as you walk around, but we're not losing anything as those species come in. Nothing that I can measure or see. So we're maintaining diversity, we're maintaining richness. And that's true in the 2000 restoration here, where brome and bluegrass are increasing. Species richness, floristic quality still look fine. And same back to that first one in 95 restoration. So what comes down to for me is thinking really carefully about why invasive species matter, right? What we don't want with invasive species is we don't want this. We don't want a monoculture of one thing that simplifies the ecosystem, reduces diversity and resilience. And it's really important to think about the objectives for a site and put that into context. So if we're managing for resilience, and we're managing for habitat size and connectivity and species diversity. And on the species diversity side, we're focused on habitat heterogeneity. We need to evaluate invasives within that context. And so it comes down to, are you measuring the invasive species or are you measuring the objectives or the impacts toward your objectives, right? I think, and that's the important word, I think we're meeting our objectives regardless of the fact that brome and bluegrass are becoming more abundant. I can change my mind. Right? 20 years from now, I could be proven wrong. And if I am, I'll come back and I'll tell you. But at least for now, I don't see any reason to be concerned. I think the grazing is doing more good than bad. I think it's creating a lot of, it's helping us reach the objectives that we have. Doesn't mean we shouldn't keep watching the brome and bluegrass, right? But I really don't feel like it's a problem. And I bring this up because I think as land managers, it's real easy to focus on the invader and then sort of forget why we care about the invader in the first place. And then you spend a bunch of time controlling something that really doesn't matter that much. Okay, and then, we're looking at things like bumblebees and small mammals, evaluating what the habitat management we're doing matters to. Plains pocket mouse is a really interesting one that we've been tracking. We have a volunteer that's looked at it for the last 10 years. And there's an argument about subspecies, but there's an eastern and a western plains pocket mouse. The eastern is not doing very well. The western's doing better. We think we've got both and some hybridization on our site, which is kind of fun. And the story that we've gotten after 10 years is that it doesn't matter what we do, the plains pocket mouse is always there. So in the years that we burn and graze the area that we're watching, the plains pocket mouse is there. In the years where we let it sit and it gets tall and thick, the plains pocket mouse is there, which is great. That gives us a lot of freedom to do things. And then the last thing I want to talk about is just that, in terms of the shifting mosaic or habitat heterogeneity, I talked about patch burning, talked about open gate. There's lots of ways to do this, right? And that's the really crucial thing. So at the Niobrara Valley Preserve, for example, we have a pasture that's about a square mile in size. And we burned so that half of the pasture was burned and half of it wasn't. And now it's part of a 5-pasture rotation. So the cattle are in here for about a month and a half during the season. But when they come in, instead of grazing the whole piece sort of similarly, half of it is burned and half of it is not. So we get heterogeneity within heterogeneity sort of that way, while still using something that's pretty comfortable for most sandhills ranchers to use, including fire, which they like a lot more. And what's really going to be fun now is the world of virtual fencing. So people have been playing around with virtual fencing. We're going to start a big experiment next year with virtual fence. That gives us so many options in terms of controlling heterogeneity through cattle grazing and potentially bison grazing, although I don't think bison like that as much. So I'm looking forward to playing around with that idea to see what more we can do with heterogeneity just by, giving cattle hints about where we want them to go and not go. So all of that is back to this idea, right? Land management is about facilitating resilience, at least in our eyes. And then the last thing is that I do a lot of what I'm doing here, right? So none of my work really matters unless it influences what other people are doing in a positive way. So just talking about the fact that we bring a lot of people to our sites, we put together workshops. A lot of our audience, by the way, for our sites is people who work with landowners. So we bring landowners to our site too, but it's really hard to get landowners to our site. So we really focus on NRCS, University Extension, Pheasants Forever, and get those private lands biologists and advisors for landowners to come. And we don't try to say, here's what you should be doing. We say, here's what we're learning. Here are some general principles that seem to apply, and then they can interpret that and extrapolate it out on the landscape. I do a lot of presentations for a lot of people. I write a blog that some people like to read. I've written a couple of books. I just pointing out that I do that. The hard thing for all of this, by the way, is measuring impact, right? How do I know if it's working? And we've tried to do some surveys and we get in some nice fuzzy but positive numbers. But I'm trying to find ways of more coherently and quantitatively measuring our impact of this outreach work. And the last thing, because there's some students in here, I want to talk about our Hubbard Fellowship, which is a one-year fellowship designed for postgraduate students. So when you graduate either from an undergraduate or a master's degree or a PhD, and you're trying to figure out what to do for a career, you can come work for us for a year. We have 2 Hubbard Fellows for a year. We do about half their time is spent doing land management. The other half is doing everything that I do, basically, and my colleagues. So they do fundraising, they do marketing, they go to strategic planning meetings, they go to workshops and conferences with us. They help us put on workshops and conferences, all those things. So if you're interested, applications are open every September. It runs February through January every year. It's a really fun program. I get to supervise the fellows. It's one of my favorite things that I do in my job. I'm going to stop there. So thank you for listening.
Chair Chris will answer questions.
Happy to. Yes, please. Yeah, thank you. So the question was about bison versus cattle grazing. What do you see in terms of differences? Not as much as you would think is the quick answer. There are not very many studies that we have available to us that compare bison and cattle fairly. Most of them, cattle are in a rotational system and the bison are in this big landscape. And then we say, oh, well, bison choose their diets differently than cattle. Well, of course they do, right? It's a grazing system. Where we have standardized it, there are some differences, but both cattle and bison really prefer grasses as the majority of their diet, right? Bison are a little stronger on that pattern than cattle, but you can adjust that up and down a lot based on management with both species, right? The bigger differences, I think, come in more behavioral things. So cattle like to stand in the water and keep the flies off their legs during the summer. Bison don't seem to have that urge. Bison don't stick around in the shade as much as cattle do. So there's some impacts that come from that you can mitigate with fencing. And virtual fencing is going to be a great way to mitigate those with cattle. And the end result, I think, is that you can do really good management with both species. I think bison work really well if you have a huge area and you've got the time and capacity to do the annual roundups that you need to do and manage them year round. Because most people who have bison own the bison, and that's a lot of responsibility. Where from cattle, if you can bring in your neighbor's cows and they take care of them and they take them home in the winter, that reduces your responsibility quite a bit. There's a lot of advantages to that, right? So as natural areas management, I like being able to use both. And I think we achieve very good things with both. So thank you for the question. Yeah. Zoom question. I'm so glad they asked. Okay, the question was, what are the resources for doing this on just a few acres, like a small pasture or a small prairie? In a lot of ways, the same thing applies, I think. It's just more challenging, right? It's really tough to graze on a small area. Just the infrastructure doesn't pay for itself alone. But I think there are a lot of ways to use the tools available, whether that's fire or mowing, for example, where you can set up a shifting mosaic and you can play around rather than burning or mowing the whole thing at the same time. use fire and maybe burn a third of it, and then burn a third of it either later that year or the next year. Try burning at different times between years. With mowing, there's a whole lot of options that people don't always take advantage of, including things not only just like where you mow, but what shape you mow with the pattern. Everybody likes squares and things like that. Like, there's no reason we have to do that other than we're humans and we like it. You can make little curly Q patterns and create, heterogeneity that way. But you could also change the height of the mower, right? You can mow some areas short, some areas high, some areas that are unmowed, and then you can flip around and you can do it at different times of year. There's a lot of ways to make shifting mosaic and heterogeneity with the tools available in a small patch. But the bigger issue with small prairies is that you're really limited in terms of what can live there and survive long term, regardless of what you do, right? You're not going to get prairie chickens on 2 acres. And even the things that a lot of the insects that are on 2 acres, if you manage well, hopefully you can favor them with your management, but they're still really at risk, right? If one thing happens to a population in a 2-acre isolated prairie, there may not be anything you can do about them disappearing, and it's really hard for them to come back. So that's the biggest challenge on small prairies is how do we make them bigger? How do we make them more connected to increase viability? And sometimes that's just not feasible. But as a society, by the way, that's just something we need to prioritize, right? I look at the way we do our private lands work sometimes, and we're getting better at it, but we don't often enough go out and target a site because we've looked on a map and we said, okay, there's a prairie here and a prairie here, and there's a gap in between. Has anybody talked to that landowner? Can we go talk to that landowner and say, look, what would it take, right? Is there any way we can talk you into doing a habitat project right here? Here's the benefits, what can we come up with for money and support and all those sorts of things? I think being more proactive would help. So I got way off your question, but I hopefully answered it also. Yeah, please. Yeah, so the question was, how do you convince ranchers, landowners that this sort of management is in their best interest? I have a couple answers for that. The first one, I think, deals with how to get people interested in prairies and the diversity in prairies in the first place, which I think is through making it fascinating. And so walking around with a landowner and talking about what you see on their land is probably the best thing you can do, right? Because they're proud of the place they have and they want to know why they should be more proud of it, and helping them be more proud is really good. So, walk around and you say, man, you got like 3 different kinds of dragonflies just right here, right? That's really neat. Here's why that's interesting. Not why, by the way, not why it's useful, why it's interesting. And I think if you show ranchers or landowners in general that by tweaking their management in certain ways, you can get more things to be proud of and more things that are interesting. I think that's a really good way to go. And then obviously you have to show that there's no downsides, right? So the open gate rotation system doesn't really have any downsides that I can think of compared to a typical rotation. It's different. It's culturally challenging maybe. So you have to have someone who's willing to do something that's weird. But if there's no downsides, you're a good part of the way there, right? And everybody focuses, not everybody, a lot of people think rightly about the economics of it, which definitely matters, right? But I think in most cases, it's the cultural pressure that matters more than the economics for most landowners. If you're anywhere close on the economics, people tend to go with what they're comfortable with. And so we have to make the things that I'm talking about culturally comfortable, which is probably the biggest challenge. But really, I think starting with fascination, if I had time to go out and walk around with every landowner in the state and I could show them all the neat things happening on their property, we'd be miles and miles ahead of where we are, I think. Kelly. Yeah. Yeah. So what are my concerns about climate change and drought? I may be overly optimistic, but I feel like prairies are really well suited for climate change in a lot of ways, right? It doesn't mean there's not big challenges, because there are, but I really enjoy going back and looking at John Weaver's work from the 30s and 40s, right? And I mean, if you haven't read that stuff, he describes these prairies in Nebraska, I think parts of Kansas too, maybe, but definitely Nebraska. I mean, completely changing in the way they look, from these diverse tall grass prairies to something that looked like a monoculture of Western wheatgrass, for example. And he talks about these pastures that turned into nothing but like 3-foot tall heath aster, 3-foot tall. He was like, it's like walking through like brush. And then when the drought ended at the end of the 30s, like it all went back. And the process of returning to where it was really fascinating. Fields and fields of like thousands of little white-eyed grass plants. in sites that they hadn't really seen much of that before. Just, it's really amazing how flexible and plastic and dynamic these plant communities are, for one thing. So not that that solves the problem, but it does give me a lot of reason to hope, right? That I think these prairies are built for this, especially in this part of the country where drought has always been a part of the process. I think the bigger issues are the way that people are going to respond to climate change and what happens. So as an example, in the Sandhills, we're already seeing, but we're projecting to see more wet springs, dry summers, right? And so that's going to change things like the kind of cattle that you want to graze on your site. If you're running cow-calf pairs, you want a pretty standard or consistent stocking rate through the season. You don't want to be selling off or gaining animals in the season. But if we have a lot more forage in the spring than we have in the summer, cow-calf pairs might not be the best way to go, right? And maybe you want to run yearlings, and maybe you want to keep some of last year's calves and run them through the first half of the next season. And then, I mean, just things like that are going to matter, as well as things like if you're wetter in the spring, and your wet meadows that you cut hay in are going to be wetter longer into the summer. That's going to maybe push people to do more ditching, right? That's an issue we need to be thinking ahead about. And can we help people spend more energy grazing those meadows instead of relying on them for hay, and then you don't have to ditch them? I mean, those are the things that I worry more about and think more about, as well as some of the way that invasive species are responding, right? Woody encroachment is a huge issue right now. That's a whole separate talk. But in general, there's a group of us that have spent about a year now talking about woody encroachment, trying to reframe it and think about it differently. Instead of just saying, well, let's keep pushing back with everything we have against woody encroachment, we're starting to play with ideas like, how do we manage a brushier prairie for biodiversity? What does that look like? Right. And we really don't know much about that, really, from a land management perspective, because we've focused on fighting the shrubs instead of trying to see what biodiversity with more shrubs looks like. I think those are the sorts of things that are going to be really important with climate change. Okay, so the question was back to the slide I showed about the complementing pollinator resources. And was that because they were different species or different phenology within the same species, was the question, right? It was a combination, I think, of different relative abundances of species between remnants and restoration. So our remnants on the Platte tend to be more on the degraded side. We're missing a lot of our big summer wildflowers, for example. Our restored prairies have a lot of big summer wildflowers. So often they were complementing each other that way. And then some of it was that there were species that were missing too. So it's hard for us to get big populations of pale poppy mallow on our restorations because it's hard to get a lot of seed. So gradually it's increasing, but our remnants have a lot more pale poppy mallow than our restoration. So sometimes it was just difference in abundance because of that too. But it was not so much phenology, I guess, to answer the rest of the question. It wasn't really tied to that.